Hey Retrospectors, I have a fantastic podcast recommendation for you, and that is Pretty Much Pop. It's a culture podcast. They talk about telly, movies, music, games, podcasts, novels, comedy, theatre, and they explore why and how we consume these things. How does pop culture even work in a world that is so fragmented? Where is the line between trash and treasure? Pretty Much Pop brings together philosophers, artists, comedians, and other smart folks to attempt to answer these questions. Most of what people like is pretty weird when you think about it. So thinking about it is what Pretty Much Pop does. You can find Pretty Much Pop, a culture podcast, wherever you're listening to this, or at prettymuchpop.com.
It's October 8th, 1600, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
It was today in history in 1600 that San Marino, the world's fifth smallest country, adopted a collection of 6 books as its governing documents, which together were called the Statutes, Decrees, and Ordinances of the Serene Republic of the Perpetual Freedom of the Land of San Marino. And wildly, the regulations they established are still in place today, leading many historians to declare San Marino as having the oldest continuously surviving constitution in the world, though also unleashing a torrent of anarchic discussion about what denotes a constitution, a nation-state, and even what's meant by the concept of continuousness.
Yeah, so this is 188 years before the US Constitution, and at least 423 before the British Constitution, because we still don't have one. But as you suggested, they hadn't worked out the benefit of brevity at this time. I mean, going first doesn't always mean going best. It's not just the title that's long. There are, as you say, 6 books, 3 of which contain over 60 articles. This is not a breezy read, trying to work out how to govern San Marino.
Yeah, part 1 addresses the ancient and often arcane roles within the San Marinese state and their various responsibilities. You know, like most small, proud, old countries, one's not too dissimilar from the UK, some would say, San Marino has a ton of rituals and traditions and costumes within its government. And actually, the statutes were compiled by Camillo Bonelli, who was serving as one of the 2 captains regent. They are San Marino's heads of state since 1243. They are elected every 6 months. By the time that he wrote these, he had already been a captain regent 3 times, and he would hold the post another 5 times afterwards. So he knew the system better than most. Part 2 is taking on civil law, the education system. Book 3 takes on criminal law. Book 4 is the judicial system. And then 5 and 6 are just a hodgepodge of anything that didn't fall under the others, including, health and sanitation regulations, weights and measures, anything that wasn't mentioned, shoved it in 5
I
and
love
6.
that consequently they're called the Extraordinarium, which does seem to cover off all of those topics quite well.
After you've got through the 4 Ordinarium, guys, it's time you deserve a treat.
Here's the good stuff, yeah.
Costume change.
Yeah. So San Marino is a very old country, actually. It derives its name from Saint Marinus, who was a stonemason from the, at the time, Roman island of Rab, which is present-day Croatia. And he got involved in this rebuilding project in Rimini on Italy's Adriatic coast after it was destroyed by Liburnian pirates. And he then went on to found an independently ruled monastic community on Mount Titan, which is about 10 miles inland of Rimini, and that is what we regard as San Marino. It's been continuously this way ever since, and still has these foundational documents that date from 1600, but they in turn were based on laws that had come from 1300 and date even further back to just around, sort of 200, 300 years AD, which is when this place really got going.
But it wasn't unusual then to have a city-state. There were loads of them all over Europe, right? It's just that this is the kind of lone survivor from that kind of era. It's the 3rd smallest state in Europe after the Vatican and Monaco. It's only about 1/3 the size of Washington, D.C., this entire country.
That notion of independence and sovereignty is at the core of San Marino's identity. As you can imagine, being right in the middle of Italy, not the most peaceful state over the centuries. It has been invaded several times, but never actually occupied for longer than a few months. A bit like Switzerland, the mountainous terrain and the spirit of the inhabitants have made it a hard territory to hold on to.
Also, why do you want it? Like, if you're Napoleon and you've got all of Italy, You'd be like, oh, just let them have their own country. That's
Yeah.
Well, supposedly, this is very apocryphal, but when St. Marinus died in 366, his last words were, "Relinquo vos liberos ab utroque homine," I leave you free from both men, which was interpreted to mean both the emperor and the pope. And the way that San Marino has been able to hold on to its independence, apart from the fact that it's mountainous, difficult to get to, and there's not really much reason to want to conquer it, is because it relies on a principle that's called cogniti nobis incogniti alias, a Latin phrase meaning known to ourselves, unknown to others. Basically, keep a low profile. And it still abides by that in 2017. It was Europe's least visited country.
Oh, that's sort of sad, really. Well, one person who did know about San Marino and actually held it up as an example was Abraham Lincoln. And he was made an honorary citizen of San Marino, writing, quote, "Government founded on republican principles is capable of being so administered as to be secure and enduring." But there are all of these questions about whether it's an actual constitution. Not least, some people say that the 6 books that comprise this document are actually a collection of laws with a smattering of public rights in them. Same goes for Magna Carta in feudal England. A lot of people say that that wasn't a proper constitution, and that neither of them set a framework for the regulation of government of a nation state. You can look to different moments in history to try to find examples of constitutions, but really a lot of them are just sort of written laws rather than a concrete document that really does set out the way that a nation functions and, crucially, the way that it functions towards its people.
Yeah, and what about the way it functions towards its women? I mean, San Marino kind of got in early with the constitution, but in terms of representation of all of its people, it was not the most progressive of European countries. Their all-male council didn't vote to allow women to hold public office and enter into binding legal and financial commitments until 1973, and they legalised abortion in 2022.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, San Marino in 1600 was not a democracy in any modern sense. The power was concentrated in the Arengo, which was a body consisting of the heads of the individual families who made up San Marino society. And until 1600, they were solely in charge of choosing members of the council. The council's kind of like the parliament of San Marino. The council itself consisted of 60 life members. Historically, those were 20 nobles, 20 smaller landowners, and 20 ordinary townsfolk. The change that the 1600 statutes made allowed the council to nominate new members themselves, which basically was even less democratic. It just kept power in a handful of elite families. This lasted all the way up until 1906, when they convened a special Arengo of all the heads of families, and they voted by a landslide in favour of universal male suffrage. The women had to wait later. But the Arengo does still exist in a peculiar form, which is twice a year when the new captain's regent take office, San Marino citizens can petition the council on non-personal matters. They have to be non-personal matters of public interest. The regents have a month to examine the petitions, and if approved, they have to be debated in Parliament within 6 months.
Well, even though this was certainly an early constitutional moment, one of the reasons that people say that maybe this wasn't the time when constitutions really took off around the world, which would have to wait for another 170 odd years, was because, part of the problem is that laws govern people, but constitutions govern governments and what they can and can't do. But they can't really exist terribly easily in a world where people aren't literate and, don't have access to printing presses. And so that's why nearly 600 constitutions were written between 1776 and 1850, including most famously the United States Constitution, which came out in 1787. And
it's rather easier to teach verbatim to school children.
Yes. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's significantly shorter for a start. But, that's because at this stage people could actually get their hands on a copy of the document and be able to then presumably start to hold their government to account when it was mistreating them. That is a critical component that surely led to the spread much, much later in history.
Don't you go thinking, though, that San Marino has the oldest parliament in the world? Not at all. That is Iceland, whose parliament was formed in 930 by Vikings. And when it comes to democracy, it's quite hard to define what we mean by democracy, of course, but if you're talking about universal suffrage, all adult citizens, regardless of sex, race or ethnicity, being able to vote on who governs them, which, as I said, San Marino has fallen woefully short on for many centuries, the oldest universal suffrage democracy is actually New Zealand. Although some would put in a claim for the Isle of Man, which was a few years before New Zealand, but that depends on whether or not you see it as part of the UK, and I feel that's a separate episode.
Now,
This episode first aired last year exclusively to members of Club Retrospectors.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/Retrospectors